Hi, I'm Paul Fotenauer, and welcome to Frontiers, where we showcase UC Davis research that helps us understand and live in a changing world. Immigration is the civil rights issue for this generation. It has become a big global business that is pulling more people into exploitation, indentured servitude, and slavery. How immigrants are treated raises questions for human rights, politics, and the economy. And yet at the same time, with the heightened fears of terrorism, vast numbers of undocumented immigrants trigger concerns about national security and the use of public resources. Today we're going to talk to two UC Davis scholars who study the global trends in immigration and the policy and civil rights issues for undocumented immigrants living in the shadows. The plight of immigrant farm workers has concerned sociologist David Kyle since he was a child growing up in Florida down the road from a large commercial farm. He has spent his career studying international immigration in its many forms, including slavery and human trafficking. In fact, Professor Kyle's second book, Global Human Smuggling, became one of the first academic books to examine this issue in different regions of the world. Kevin Johnson grew up with relatives on both sides of the Mexican-U.S. border and family members whose immigration status varied. A professor of law and Chicano studies, he focuses his research on the legal and ethical issues of immigration and civil rights. He is the author of How Did You Get to Be Mexican and the Huddled Masses Myth. Professor Johnson provides leadership with Legal Services of Northern California and the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Gentlemen, welcome to Frontiers.
Thanks for having us.
First question, David, is you say that immigration has become just not a means to an end, but a highly profitable global business. How so?
That's right, Paul. All over the world now we have people who are profiting over what we would just call migration services of all sorts. It could be legal, but often they are illegal activities. For example, smuggling would be the one that really concerns us here today. And this is highly profitable because you really need no startup capital. You really don't need that many skills. You really only need the desire to export people in some ways. These kinds of activities range from criminal syndicates to kind of mom and pop organizations.
Well, let me follow up on the criminal smugglers. What impact are they having?
The criminal smugglers are having mostly an impact in the area of what we call human trafficking. And this is when migrants become slaves. They become tricked. They're tricked into slavery. They think that they're being smuggled to a job, and in the end they find out that it's really slavery.
Now, Kevin, you don't think increased border enforcement is the answer. Why not?
What we've seen over the last 10 years is a dramatic increase in border enforcement. President Clinton put together a couple of high-profile operations along the border that have made it much more deadly to cross the border. Thousands of people have died, and human trafficking has gone up. In fact, fees for smuggling have gone up dramatically from a few $100s in the 1990s to a few $1,000s today. People keep coming to the United States. It's lucrative to traffic them to the United States, and they're able to find jobs relatively easily in the United States. Employers employ undocumented workers. Undocumented workers can get employment. And what we've seen over the last 10 years, despite the most dramatic increase in border enforcement in U.S. history, is a doubling of the undocumented immigrant population from about 5 million to roughly around 12 million today. So what we see is it's had deadly impacts, and it's had little impact on the undocumented immigrant population.
So in spite of the threat of death, that these immigrants are still taking the risk in coming to the United States?
There are hundreds of people a day. I was down in south of Tucson a few months ago in a small town called Altad, Mexico, and it was a sleepy little town a few months ago, about 6 months ago, and it's become a big center for border crossing, and there's a large business of people who will drive people close to the border over roads. There are people who will walk through the desert in the middle of the night with their family, coming to the United States for jobs. People are willing to risk life and limb, literally, to come to this country for work.
Now, David, immigrants are finding ingenious ways to enter into this country where they can avoid Border Patrol agents. How do they do that?
Any way they can. I mean, the numbers of strategies are increasing every day. I'm always surprised every time I focus on a new country or go there. I just got back from doing some research in Fiji, and every single country has some similarities with other countries and how they do it, but they also have unique ways of doing it. Overall, though, they're using the same globalization, transportation, and communication technologies that we all use. But I think that we have to distinguish between those who are kind of smuggled in the dead of night, say across the Mexican border, and those who are overstaying visas by getting in through some kind of legal means. But the overall strategy is still smuggling strategy because it's about overcoming U.S. immigration and labor laws.
Can you give me some specific examples of some of these ingenious ways?
Well, one of the most ingenious ways was where some Chinese refitted a cargo ship, a cargo container, with air conditioning, cooking utensils, and they were in that hold for months, sealed in a container and in a perfectly livable container, and were offloaded here in the U.S.
Do you think that more of that goes on than we realize?
Undoubtedly, much more of that goes on than we realize. I think that the cases that we know of are simply the ones that didn't do a very good job. So there's always a problem in social research where we're only looking at those people who got caught. There's a pattern there. And when I do research in the sending countries, it becomes more obvious of how many people have been actually successful.
And Kevin, how would you characterize the life of an undocumented immigrant that's in this country? Is life easy or is it hard?
Well, I think it's extremely difficult, Paul. Undocumented immigrants, as President Bush has acknowledged, live in the shadows of American life. They're subject to exploitation in many jobs. They can be subject to slavery and voluntary servitude. Many of them have to work to pay off their smuggling debt once into the United States. And even in California, we've seen an increase in slavery and enslavement of immigrants. We also see the failure of employers in many instances to comply with basic minimum wage and condition laws. We see a situation where many undocumented immigrants can't even drive a car without fear of being removed from the country and uprooted from their life in the United States. So it's a very difficult life on the margins, very difficult to establish the kinds of roots that we expect people to establish here once they're in this country. And it's really a shame the way that many undocumented immigrants are treated in sort of the periphery of American social life, even though they give a great deal to this country in terms of economic benefits. I mean, we have undocumented immigrants and immigrant workers in construction, domestic service, other service industries, farm work, and make important contributions to the economy that they often don't credit for, where they are able to help us keep prices down for poultry and produce, for housing, for hotels and restaurants. It's really a situation where we have an important part of our labor force that's not protected by the laws, that's exploited and demeaned at every turn.
Once they're here, what are the legal obstacles to get them to stay in this country?
Well, under the law, some of them might be eligible for certain types of relief after a period of time, but many who come to this country didn't have a lawful way of entering into the United States. The immigration laws are fairly restrictive, and for people from certain countries, you'd have to wait a very long time before you could immigrate to the United States. To immigrate lawfully under certain kinds of visas from the Philippines and India and Mexico, three very high immigrant sending countries in the United States, you might have to wait 10 to 20 years. If you're from other countries like the United Kingdom or Spain, you might have to wait a year or two. So one of the things people don't realize when they talk about undocumented immigrants, when they say they should wait in line, that the lines differ by different countries. And some people may not even have a line to get into because of the restrictive nature of immigration laws. So one of the reasons that Congress this year was talking about a legalization program of some sort was to bring people who have been in this country for a prolonged period of time, who have made contributions to our economy, who are part of our communities, who work here, to make sure that they could somehow regularize their status. That's sort of gotten bottlenecked in Congress, but that's one of the things that President Bush raised.
And David, is there a link between migrant trade then and slave trade?
Yes, absolutely. If we didn't have the large numbers, as Kevin has said, the increase in migrant smuggling leads to the opportunities for criminal syndicates as the bottom feeders of this phenomena to trick and take advantage of these migrants, especially in the vulnerable process of trying to cross a border. it's very easy to really kind of pick them off and turn them into slaves. And we see this all over the world. This isn't just a U.S.-Mexico issue.
Now we know that this past spring and summer, proposed immigration reform stirred thousands to protest in this country. What do these marches mean for the future of immigration and civil rights?
To me, it's uncertain precisely what they mean. I think that the marches in the spring of 2006 were really unprecedented in United States history. You had immigrants, immigrant supporters, citizens, not just Latino immigrants. In Chicago, you had Polish immigrants. In Boston, you had Irish immigrants. It was hundreds of thousands of people who were taken to the streets, who were protesting, at least initially protesting, the very punitive provisions of the Sensenbrenner bill. Later on, some of the later marches in the spring talked about justice for immigrants and amnesty for immigrants and undocumented immigrants who've been in this country. In the long term, it's unclear to me whether this immigrant rights movement is going to transform into a more general civil rights movement or is going to kind of fizzle out. And at this point, it seems like it may have fizzled out a bit. But it certainly showed, I think, Congress that the very punitive provisions that had been in the Sensenbrenner bill just weren't going to cut it.
Well, a question for both of you on this topic. How should U.S. immigration policy be reformed? David?
Well, I'd like to also I'll answer that question by picking up on something that Kevin just said, which is, and your question was the meaning of this. I think that in some ways we have as much, not only just a civil rights, have a new civil rights movement on our hands, or when we look at this, but also sort of anti-prohibition movement, in the sense that the economic and social and cultural forces here are so much greater than what we're trying to do on the border. I mean, they would not be coming here if we didn't have the jobs. And we really see this as a global phenomenon. We talk about globalization. We tell other countries that you need to find something to export. And so that's exactly what they're doing. And as Kevin said, they wouldn't be coming here if we didn't have jobs. So if we look at it as an anti-prohibition movement, it's a somewhat different phenomena. Think of any other kind of criminal group, if we want to characterize illegal migrants as criminals, as some do. Buchanan just came out with a book talking about the invasion of the third world and kind of advocating even deeper criminalization of these migrants. I would say, though, I don't see cocaine dealers taking to the streets in large numbers. I think this is a clue that this is an economic phenomena, and they don't feel that this is a real crime, and I think with some reason. On the other hand, I think the American public has a right to have some answers. What is going on here? What would it take? I think that until there's a sort of global understanding of some of these economic processes and understanding of why they're coming here, I don't think that any policies or enforcement strategies on the border will stop this.
And Kevin?
I think David's absolutely right. We're at a point in our history where we have immigration laws that are just inconsistent with the economic realities of immigration. We have immigration laws that make it difficult for employers who want workers. We have immigration laws that make it difficult for immigrant workers who want to work in the United States. We need a set of immigration laws that are much more consistent with our economic, social, and political needs than currently exist. Over the last few years, we have immigration laws and policies that have focused on enforcement only, that have tried to close the door on immigration. In the Sensenbrenner bill was one of those. We have focused unduly in recent years on national security, in my estimation, and not enough on really the bread and butter economic issues that involve immigration. The one thing that I guess I want to add about the protests in the spring, that they were very important in a number of ways. And I think that many minorities, particularly Latinos, realize that the discussion and debate about immigration in no small part is about race. And when you read some of these look at some of these websites, read Pat Buchanan's book, read Samuel Huntington's book, which has a chapter on the Hispanicization of immigration, realize this isn't just about economics, it's not just about national security, it's also about national identity. It's also about the race of the people coming to the United States. And I think that we have to address those issues and think about those issues and not bury them in our immigration laws.
Let me talk about security. It's been 5 years since the attacks of September 11th. How does this country reconcile illegal immigration with national security concerns?
How does it reconcile it in the sense of how does one affect the other? I would say that we can't understand the border buildup without our fear of terrorism and our desire to control terrorists coming in. And this goes back to the first bombing of the World Trade Center. This is when the fence started going up in '95. This was one of the things that the government was saying. It's less publicized than the kind of anti-immigrant side of things, but in part it was a desire to control who's coming in. I think a misplaced strategy, but that was partly what was driving it. I think that security issues is a serious concern on the border. I also agree with Kevin that a lot of this anti-immigrant rhetoric and control of the border is driven by racism as well. But there is a legitimate concern about border security and terrorism. I happen to think, though, that the strategies we've been pursuing on the border won't get us to where we're trying to go in terms of controlling terrorism. After all, most of the 9/11 bombers didn't cross in the dead of night or the U.S.-Mexico border or even the Canadian border. Some did over Canada through the Canadian border, but not over the Mexican border. They will always find a way to get in if they want to.
Let me ask you this. Shaping immigration policy for Congress, is this going to be settled at the ballot box?
To me, it's a political question that Congress in this nation is going to have to address in the 21st century. It may not be this year, may not be next year, but politically, we're going to have to come up with an immigration law and policy that makes sense for the country. Unfortunately, throughout our history, we've sort of dropped the ball when it's come to making sense in immigration law and policy. We made some deep and enduring mistakes. But in my estimation, it's not going to come from the United States Constitution. It's not going to come from the courts. It's going to come from people and legislatures, and that's where the change is going to come. And it's going to take some time, because I think incidents like September 11th and the security concerns that they raise are legitimate ones, very legitimate security concerns, sometimes come to dominate immigration law and policy and almost have become a myopic focus of immigration law and policy since September 11th. But if you're really worried about national security, you should be worried about things like the fact that we have so little enforcement along the northern border with Canada, when in fact apparently the only alleged terrorist who's ever tried to enter the country came from Canada, the Millennium Bomber in 1999. And that gives sort of fodder to the people who say it's all about race, or it's largely about race. We're militarizing the U.S.-Mexico border and we're ignoring the Canadian border. But I also think that if you're really worried about security and national security, and I am, you have to come up with a system where you have some kind of record of the identities and addresses of undocumented immigrants who are living in the United States, if that's what you're truly interested in.
I'd like to thank both of you for appearing on Frontiers.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you who joined us for today's discussion. You can learn more about this subject by visiting our website at frontiers.ucdavis.edu.